All right. Everybody, thanks for joining today. This is our monthly DevCast series where we cover some topic on Genesys Cloud in terms of developers. And today I have John Carnell with me again. He's architect and team lead of developer engagement here at Genesys. And he will be introducing us to a new tool that we call the Genesys Cloud CLI, or command line interface. Before I turn it over to John, I just have a couple of logistics to cover off. So there will be a 10-minute Q&A, at least a 10-minute Q&A session at the end of this tutorial. If you have a question during the tutorial, I would encourage you to use the Q&A function in Zoom and post your question there. We do have folks who can try and answer as the webinar is going on, or we will answer it live at the end. Also, this tutorial is being recorded and will be uploaded to our community YouTube channel. You can get to those videos by visiting our developer center at developer.mypurecloud.com/video, or click on the video link on the landing page. That will take you to our videos page, and you can then get to our YouTube channel from there to watch this video offline. And with that, I am going to stop my sharing session and turn it over to John. All right,
Morning,
John, it's all yours. Take it away.
All right, thanks. Let me just go ahead and get my PowerPoint started and then share my screen. I hope everybody's doing well today as we start another spring. All right, and I am going to screen share real quick. All right. Jim, can you see my screen, and is everything good?
Not yet. I don't think you're sharing yet, John. Try again.
Oh, that was unusual. I thought I was.
You are sharing, John.
Oh, you are sharing. It's behind mine. Go ahead.
Okay, no problem. Perfect. I was like, uh-oh, I'm not sharing right now. Well, good morning, everybody. Hold on a minute. I want to go back to the beginning. Excuse me a moment. I'm having difficulty with PowerPoint. Let's try this again. All right. Good morning, everybody. I hope everybody is doing well. My name is John Carnell. Today, we're going to talk about the new Genesys Cloud CLI, or command line interface. And I'm going to go through the first part of this presentation is really just going to give you a little bit of history and philosophy behind the CLI. The reason being, I think it's important for people to understand what's out there, what are the capabilities, and how quickly we can add stuff to the CLI if we find gaps. I know for me, a CLI is a necessary part of my everyday life. It was a goal of mine when I came into the developer engagement group to build a CLI quickly, because many, many, many years ago, I had started my career as an Oracle DBA and a Unix admin. And I have had to, over the course of my career, have to do system administration and development with various platforms. And especially when you're doing bulk stuff, a CLI is just invaluable. So a little bit about me. Yes.
John, I'm sorry to interrupt. Try and share one more time.
Sure. All right. Share screen. I'm just going to share my whole screen.
That is much better.
All right. All right. Honest, I really do know what I'm doing from a technical perspective, or at least I like to tell myself every morning that. But I've been in software development for about 25 years now. Like I said, I've done a lot of work over the course of my career in software development and platform and infrastructure administration. Sometimes I joke my job is as much DevOps and infrastructure management as it is writing code. But I've been with Genesys for about 6 years, and in this team role, almost for about a team lead role for developer engagement for almost about a year now. So the CLI kind of has a funny story, because it started really as a hackathon project late last year. I think it was almost in November. And it was a hackathon project that had been submitted by one of our partners and one of our internal employees to say, hey, we want to do a CLI. We're going to do it in Python. And so they did a really, really cool CLI. They did a great hackathon performance. And my boss saw it and he's like, you know, John, they did that in 2 days. Why can't you turn around something quicker? So, of course, when your boss says, hey, why don't you turn around something quicker? That means, hey, let's try something on a Saturday and start working through it. So this was me on a Saturday and going through a weekend on a coding jag and ended up coming up with a good prototype CLI written in Go. And there's some reasons why we chose Go I'll get into in a little bit. But once I got through the prototype, I went to our product manager, Becky Powell, and said, Becky, we can get this done pretty quickly. And I know there's a lot of customers asking for this. There's kind of a gap here. So the guys down below were really our team that helped build the CLI, do the testing, and then also give us a lot of feedback. So what we're going to show you guys, it was delivered very quickly over the last 3 or 4 months with a lot of intense activity, but it involved a lot of people, a lot of talent going into it. Okay. So our agenda is going to be really covering why a CLI. I sometimes run into this with people who are purely software developers and haven't done a lot of platform administration. They're going to ask that question. So I'm going to go through a couple of use cases why a CLI is important. I'm going to look at our philosophy for our CLI design. And those will probably be about 10 slides. I'm not going to walk through just slideware. We're going to do a live demo. Hopefully everything works out the way it should work out. And then I'm going to give you some closing thoughts on the CLI and what's coming next and where we're at and what we want to do with it. So the first thing is why a CLI? And CLIs, I really like to start out with just kind of a use case example, because I think a lot of us who have done telephony administration, I actually had done that in a previous life, been an IT manager for a telephony group. We often get into these situations where there's a new marketing promotion, there's some new business initiative, or something's happening in the environment where we need to very quickly react to it. It might be moving users between queues, setting up new queues, doing administrative tasks. So this is the same presentation I gave internally to our own development tools. As the use case was, you got this guy, Rick, he's the head of the call center management. He tells Mike, the telephony engineer, who's in charge of Genesys Cloud, he's like, man, we got a new promotion. We got to get this everybody with a 401k specialization over to these new queues in preparation for call volume that's going to hit us on Monday. Now, of course, it's Friday afternoon. That's always when these things come in, right? Is we need this. We forgot to tell somebody. And, Mike wants to go fishing. And Rick really doesn't care about Mike's son or Mike's happiness or going with his son. So Mike has to figure out a way to get stuff done quickly. And it might not be pretty. It might not be doable. And he doesn't want to have to write code to do it. There's a time and a place for writing code. And then there's a time and a place for using a CLI. So fortunately, Mike has the Genesys Cloud CLI, and he was very quickly able to pull together a script. And it was an ugly script, but it got the job done. That basically just went out and said, hey, I'm going to find all the users and download all their skills. I'm going to dump it to a file. I'm going to look for any users that belong to I'm going to get a list of any of the queues and find the one that is equal to NewCo. I'm going to get its ID, and I'm going to just basically go through one at a time and chunk through, or in groups of 100, chunk through and move users through that queue. It's not pretty, but it's something that we often run into when we're managing a platform, is that we've got to be able to put together stuff quickly. So fortunately, it worked out for everybody. Rick got what he wanted. Mike got to go fishing with his son. So everybody worked out. And that's usually the nature of when a CLI can really help kind of save the day. So as we get into our CLI and what we did here, I want to walk through our philosophy a little bit behind it. And the philosophy, when I sat down with my team, I did the prototype, and it was very small, got it working. But then I turned to the guys on my team and I said, we really need to start with a philosophy of how we're going to build this thing. Because CLIs can range from very small, simple things to massive tools with a lot of functionality and capability built within them. Anybody who's worked with AWS can sometimes see their CLI is an amazing work of art. So what we wanted to do is we want to start with something very, very small without a lot of predefined notions of how it will be used, or force users down into things like, you're only going to be able to get the data in this format, and you're only going to be able to save it to files. And stuff like that. So as we go through our examples, I hope that you'll kind of see some of this as we go through it. The other thing is I really wanted to strive for consistency with our public API. As much as possible, the individual commands in our CLI map up to our public API commands. As a matter of fact, when you see later on in the demonstration, you can actually see in the help section, whenever we're doing a CLI command, we provide the endpoint that's actually being invoked, and we provide the permissions and everything else, because the CLI for me was more than just an administrative tool. I often use it to very quickly poke different parts of our API. So when we say we're consistent with our public API, it also means we try to avoid changing or manipulating any of the JSON data that's being sent to our public API, or changing or manipulating any of our data that's coming back from our public API. So if you're very, very familiar, if you're familiar with our API, it should be very easy to pick up our CLI. The third thing we tried to do is we wanted to say we were consistently discoverable. So that should mean that every time you use the CLI, you should have at least the same set of basic commands as you're working your way through the different objects that we're exposing in the CLI. We really, really worked hard to try to say, you know, once you figure out one thing, it should be pretty easy to kind of go through and figure out the other parts. And the fourth part of our philosophy was really about making it composable. Now, I'm a Unix admin by kind of my background and training from early on in my career. And we have a philosophy of small, sharp tools that can be combined together to do different things. So for instance, we're going to show later on in our demonstration, we don't try to build filtering using on our JSON objects. Instead, I'm going to show you guys how we use JQ, a tool that does transformation and filtering very well on JSON objects, and mix it with our CLI to be able to parse and transform data returned by our public API. I'll also be showing there's a couple of examples later on where we use Unix xargs to go and pass values from one API to the next. The last part is we want to make our tool easily deployable and performant. And this was important. This was actually one of the reasons why we chose to write our tool in Go rather than go off and use Python, because anybody who's used Python, Python's a very powerful environment, but it's very easy to run into some very basic environment issues. And we didn't want to run into any of that. Instead, we wanted to be able to build down to a binary, a single binary that could be deployed very easily to the particular target platform that you were looking for. So right now we provide the source code, and we'll show you guys later on. So you can build on whatever platform you want with the tool, with the CLI. But we also provide pre-compiled binaries for Windows, Linux, and OS X. And that's worked out pretty well. I mean, a lot of people that have used it, they like to build their own stuff, but others are just like, hey, I need to get my job done. Just give me the binary and I'll be done with it. So when we talk about consistency and why we built our CLI to be small, is anybody who's worked very long with our API knows that it's very deep, meaning there's a lot of commands, or it's very wide with a lot of commands, and it's very deep with some commands having multiple levels down. So early on during the CLI process, we decided that we were going to go out and just try to generate off of our Swagger docs an entire CLI. Well, it really didn't work out well. As you can see, hopefully over to the right, you end up with this massive amount of Git commands with a very unwieldy command structure. So what we chose to do is we said, you know what? We're going to use code generation to generate the majority of our CLI, but we're going to do a mapping exercise, and we're only going to expose objects that we feel comfortable that we've mapped out and that we think, at least for our initial release, a lot of people are going to get value from. So as you guys start playing with the CLI and start using it, you might find pieces in there that are missing, like why isn't this API in there? You know, it was our first release of the CLI. We are looking for feedback. It does not take us to long to turn around and expose new commands. It's just a matter of making sure that they're in an intelligent structure so that they stay true to our idea of being consistently discoverable. So with that note, I would say if there's something in our CLI that you don't see, let us know. File an idea on the ideas portal. Drop us a line in the forum. We literally have turned out some of our requests and 2-3 hours and made them available. So we'll go on to the next slide then. So when we say our CLI is small and predefined notions of how it will be used, again, we're only focusing on a small subset of objects that follow basic patterns. So when you go out, you will see all of these objects out there by just typing in the GC command, and you'll see all the available top level objects that we've made available in the CLI. And on almost every single one of them, we provide a minimum of 5 basic commands: create, update, delete, list in terms of get it all. You want to do a query or you want to pull back all the data, and read. All right. So kind of with our comment about our consistency with our public API, we use JSON for all data passed in and out of the CLI. That means that the JSON data structure matches exactly what's in the public API. We make a little asterisk there on one particular command. We use an OAuth client credential grant to control access to the platform. So you have to go into Genesys Cloud, you have to set up an OAuth client credential grant, and you have to give it the level of access that you feel comfortable for that administrator to be able to have, or that group of administrators. However, that means then that if there's certain things you don't want administrators to do, you just don't give it to the client grant. And if they try to do something in the CLI that they're not allowed to, they'll get basically a permission denied error being returned back from the JSON. Now, that last part, I kind of mentioned this. We never manipulate the JSON to be different from the API. The only place we did that is on our list command, which you'll see shortly. We actually do provide an option to do auto pagination. One of the things about working with our public API that I personally have found always a little bit painful is a lot of times you're going to be pulling back a lot of data, and you have to write all the pagination code if you're going to use our API at the lowest level. With our CLI, we do allow you to go ahead and pull all that data back at once. And we've got a couple different options when it comes to listing out data. All right. So kind of getting back to what I alluded to, just about every command is going to have 5 objects with it: create, delete, get, list, and update. Some of our commands are going to have subcommands in them because, like I said, our API is very, very deep at points. I think in the previous slide, I pointed out that in one, I think it was our WEM API, we had 148 endpoints. So we didn't want to just expose 148 commands without some sense of hierarchy or depth. Okay, so I'm going to show you a real simple example, and we're getting close to the demo. But here is an example of the idea of us being small, sharp, and mixable. We want things to be composable. So one of the things, and this came from an actual real life intervention that we did with a customer to try to figure out why some of their integrations were failing, is we needed a mechanism to go out and report usage queries to basically find out how many calls were happening for each of their client credentials for their integrations. And so what we ended up doing is we're like, okay, well, we have a usage API. We have the ability to query it. And we want to get that data out and really be able to dump it into a CSV format and be able to go out and then put it in a pivot table and be able to work on it and kind of slice and dice to understand, what were 200s, what were 300s, how many were they getting? Were they getting 429s? What time and date was that happening? So what we ended up doing is using our CLI and combining it with JQ to basically manipulate the output coming from our CLI and use JQ to do what it does best, which was manipulate the JSON and dump it into other formats. And I'll give you guys an example of this later on. We're going to take this exact same query and you can actually see the results of that out there. Okay, so and here's another example that we had out there where we basically just list all of our queues. And we want to find the chat queue. We want to get all the queues, search for the queue by name, and then find all the users that belong to that queue. So we actually use our CLI. We use JQ to filter out the queue names that contain chat2. We get the ID of that queue, and we use a Unix XR command to dump it back into another GCQ users call or GC call to look up all the users associated with that particular with that particular queue, and then just dump it out into an array list using JQ. Now this can get really, really crazy really fast. And I think anybody who's done administration knows how wide and deep some of these CLI commands can be done. But sometimes when you need to get stuff done quickly and you don't want to write a bunch of code to do it, a CLI can save you. So our CLI was meant to be easily deployable and performant. And we really tried to focus, and we open source the entire CLI. So you can actually look at all the code. You can look at the code generation process. You can even do a PR, or if you want to modify the CLI on your own, you can do that, or open a PR and submit changes back to us. But really, we focus on just building a very, very small core of logic that handled the HTTP invocation, pagination, retry, all the kind of the core services that we want to spread across the CLI. Then we use code generation and a mapping layer, basically the same code generation process we use for building our SDKs, to be able to go out and generate commands. But we still left an escape hatch, kind of in the whole build process, because sometimes, what makes a decent or easy enough API command isn't something that's very easy to do with a CLI. So for instance, we had one particular command where we're dealing with the usage command, where we wanted to wait until the data came back. We didn't want to make people who were working with the CLI have to write some kind of polling script to go out and poll over and over and over again to see if their query was done. So what we ended up doing is we wrote an extra, we made that command manually, and then we added some extra flags. And you saw, I think it was -W, and I think in our latest version, it's -T for timeout. That said, hey, just basically wait X number of minutes and just keep polling with the appropriate amount of back off logic in it, so that we can just issue a query for some data and get the data back. So I want to share that with you because everything comes down to just these 3 binaries. But if you do want to go out and be able to poke around and do things or see what we're doing with our CLI under the covers, you're more than welcome to. It's completely open source. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a live demo. Hopefully everything's going to work. I've included a lot of slides from the demo here, so that if, I always like to make my slides available. Jim, I don't know if we're able to upload or add the slides, but if you're reading it later, everything we're showing in the demo will also be available as part of a deck. So let me go ahead. I'm going to stop my share for just a minute. And I am going to get myself set up to basically walk through the CLI. Okay. And then from here, I'm going to share my screen. All right. Jim, can you please confirm for me that everybody can see my screen, or Becky?
All looks good, John. Keep going.
Okay, so what I've done is I've actually set up a Vagrant box on my OS 10 box, just so I have a nice clean environment for the CLI. The first thing I want to do is, once I've got the CLI downloaded, which I can do with just this Linux script right up here. We can download a shell script. It just puts it in user local bin GC. And the first thing I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to provision some credentials. So I've already got a client credential, an OAuth client credential grant set up in my Genesys Cloud org. And what I can do is I can go out and I can go GC profiles new. And the GC profiles command basically lets you list and create the configuration that your CLI can do. So everything that we're doing in terms of the different profiles that we use and which OAuth clients we use are first configured through our GC profiles command. Now, all that does underneath the covers is it creates a file under the .gc directory called config.toml that holds all this information. So I'm going to go GC profiles new, and it's going to walk me through a little command line wizard that's going to ask me what the name of the profile is. Now, default is obviously the default profile that will be used. And if you don't pass in a -p flag on your command, it will always assume that you want to use default. Now, you can have multiple profiles set up and you can give it whatever name you want. So oftentimes if I have to do stuff back and forth across organizations, I might have multiple profiles set up and then just access them in there. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to say I'm going to go with the default profile. And then you're going to be asked to enter your environment. It defaults to the mypurecloud.com, which is our US East environment. But if you have to, if you're working out of our Germany region or Australia region, you would just use the environment variable that you would set out there for your region and go from there. So I'm going to select default US East. And now what I'm going to do is I am going to put a client ID out here, and I am going to disable my client ID and secret right after this presentation, or at least change the secret. But I'm going to cut and paste my client ID. And I'm going to cut and paste my secret. Now, what's going to happen as soon as I hit enter here, it's actually going to try to authenticate before it writes this information out to the .gc to make sure the client ID and the client secret are valid. I know early on when we first built the CLI, we didn't have this in here, and it was kind of annoying because if you got one character wrong in your secret or your ID, or cut and paste an extra space, it could cause problems for us. All right. So now if I go out, I can go GC profiles list, and I can list all the profiles that are out there. Now, right now, I don't have a, I don't have any other profile set up. So let's see if I can actually do anything here. I'm going to go out and I'm going to use first the GC command. So let's just see what's going on here. These are all the top level objects that we have out here. And we tried to follow a noun verb format for our CLI because again, we wanted to try to be consistent. So you can see out here, we have a number of different top level commands like GC campaigns, all the way down to users, usage, stations, skills, so on and so forth. So now what I can do is let's go ahead and take a look at one of those top level commands. I'm going to go GC users, and I can see the full list of commands that are available for GC users. I can also see there's a command out there for queues and skills that are subcommands. So I can create a user, delete a user, get a user, list a user, and update a user. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to go GC users list. I want to get all of the JSON that is out there, and just to see if my connection's working. Ah, there we go. So basically, we're getting back the same JSON that we would if we called the users command directly. So let's go out, and you'll notice right now it's just the first page of data that's being returned here. So let's go out and let's just take a look at the help command directly for GC users list. Because me personally as a developer, a lot of times I will prototype stuff using the CLI or do a little bit of activity with the CLI. And then if I have to write code, I can go ahead and put it in my code and understand or be able to look at the documentation involved with that particular command. So a couple things that you'll see out there is one, we have the, we take and expose the operation that is associated with this command. So if you were actually to look out in the Developer Center on the documentation for this particular API, you might notice that there is a boatload of query parameters out there. So one of the things we do is when we take our Swagger documentation, any query parameters associated with an API are automatically converted into flags on that particular command. So for instance, on the GC users command for getting all of the users, they have the ability to pull back an expanded list of data. So we can say, give me all the user information, but I also want the presence information for each user. Give me a list of user IDs that I'm going to just fetch in bulk. So maybe I don't want all of them. You can also control the page number and the page size. However, with the list command, I also want to point out, this is where we change things up just a little bit differently than what the API is out there. The default behavior for GC users list, or for any of our list commands, is we basically just return back the first page of data. But that can be a little bit painful if you're trying to script something or if you need to get all of the data associated with a particular user object. So let's say you want all the users, you want all the groups because you want to run them through JQ, do some transformation on them, or pipe them off to someplace else, and it'd be really painful if you have to do each call at a time. So I'm going to go GC users list, and I am going to pass in the -A option. Now, what the -A option does is it stands for auto paginate. And what the CLI will do on any list command then is basically do all of the pagination for you. It will call all of the paginated calls synchronously, one at a time, gather all the data, and put it out and return it as a single array of JSON objects. Now, with the -A option, we also strip out all the pagination information. So we can go out and we can go GC users list, and we will return back a full list of all the users. So it makes it very easy to manipulate and script stuff without having to get into some of those lower level API details. Now, one thing to be aware of too is for all of our CLI commands, we follow our retry logic that we've documented out on the Developer Center. So any 429s, 502s, I believe 503s, and 504s, I could be getting one of them wrong. Basically, if we receive those calls during the course of returning or doing anything with that data, we will apply a back off policy. If it is a call that has a retry after header set on it, we will automatically try to do the retry after header. Now, the reason why we did this is because a lot of times you're going to want to do data dumps, ad hoc data dumps. You're going to want to maybe do some light integration work with this. And you're not going to want to sit there and have to deal with auto pagination and dealing with 429 and retriable logic. So we've built that all out there for you. Now, one of the more interesting parts of this, I'm going to show you another command. This is a GC users list S command for stream command. And what we did here is we have some commands like external contacts that can literally return back 1 million records. And we're not going to be able to load that all in memory. But, you know, if you try to load too much data and your machine is too small, you'll get a nasty looking Golang stack dump and then saying it's run out of memory. But on any of our list commands, you can also do a stream, in which case it will grab each page using basically retry logic if it runs into any 429s, but it will stream it out immediately as it receives it. Now, it's important to note that we don't return this as a JSON array because we're not gathering all the data. Instead, we're returning each individual record or page of record. And in this case, we're leaving the pagination in there. So this is really useful if you're dealing with large amounts of data, or if you've got a large amount of data and you don't want to have to get all of the data to walk back through it. Instead, you could start streaming the data, passing it off to another script that would then look at, hey, did I meet my condition here? And just stop without having to go through all the data. So that's one of the reasons why we ended up putting a stream command in here. And it's also one of the reasons Andy Johnson from our external contacts team was so heavily involved with us, because he's like, man, we're going to break your CLI. We return a huge amount of data. Okay, so let's go ahead and just keep moving forward. So we've got like I said, I just want to illustrate some of the value added stuff that we added to the CLI is auto pagination, automatic retry logic, and automatic and streaming logic. And I bring this up because the CLI taught us a lot of things and also forced us to look at our SDKs, because a lot of the stuff that we've been doing in our CLI, like auto pagination and automated retry logic, we want to consistently carry forward into our SDKs. Anybody who's worked with multiple languages of our SDKs knows that there's inconsistencies on how they do certain things. So a lot of really, really good lessons learned here. Okay, so we went out, we did a GC users list. That was probably the easiest command to do. So let's go out and let's just see what some of the other commands can do. So let me grab one. We can do obviously a GC users get. And I can pull back an individual record. And if you do a GC users get and look at it, you can actually see we're using a different endpoint underneath the covers. So one thing I want to bring up when you think about our CLI, and this is something to be aware of, we have, you know, for better or worse, we have idiosyncrasies in our APIs. We are limited in our CLI by whatever the public API, our platform API can do. Later on, I'm going to show you some of this. I wrote a little Python and CLI script to demonstrate how we work around some of our shortcomings, for instance, on our queue APIs, where we can only add one user at a time to our, or not one user, 100 users at a time to a queue. So we found some ways to work around that. But if you're using our CLI and you're like, man, why is this behaving this way? Chances are it's the public API, also our platform API underneath the covers that has the exact same idiosyncrasies in it. When we find them, we sometimes do the extension points and trying to wrapper it to make people's lives easy, but we're always weighing that against trying to do too much and changing or breaking the consistency between the public platform API and our CLI. Okay, so we just went through a GC user's get command. So what happens though, and this is a question I have, and it was actually something that really irritated me when I first started working with our public API, is a lot of times we don't have an easy way to find objects by their logical names. You have to know the GUID ahead of time, or you have to call the API to be able to go look it up. So one of the first use cases when I was prototyping out the CLI was, how can I use our CLI and something like with JQ to be able to go out and find a user based on a particular value, or a group based on their logical human readable name, and retrieve them? Well, this is an example of one such command where I can return the entire object for my John Carnell record, but I don't know what the ID is. So JQ has a very awesome filtering mechanism for being able to do kind of selects and queries on return JSON. So I'm taking my GC users list, I'm doing auto pagination, I'm going to do a page size of 100, so I can do the minimum number of calls at a time and just get my data quicker. And I'm going to pipe it over to JQ and say, give me any record that whose username contains john.carnell@genesys.com. All right. And it basically went through, I think we have several hundred users out there. I've done this with as many as 27,000 users. It takes a little bit more time, but not much. And I found that specific user record. Okay, that's great. But a lot of times I want to be able to go out and I want to be able to find a particular GUID because I'm poking around with it in my code, or my code has to know it for this particular item. How do I find that out so that I can go out and understand it? Let me just grab this command. We're going to do this time with the groups. We're going to find a group whose name is equal to IRA. We're going to do a list, but I'm going to pipe it through to JQ and say the only thing I'm interested in is the ID for that particular record. And what I found is I end up a lot of times I wrote a little Python script that exposes this command and then do an alias so that I can go out and I can look at any of our objects and just say, here's the name I'm looking for, go give me the ID. And that's the type of stuff a CLI is really good at. And that's what administrators and developers need, is kind of those small ad hoc tools. So let's do something a little bit bigger. Let's go out. I am going to go a GC users list. We can see that the ID is 231, F7, F33. I'm not going to read the whole thing out. But here's what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, give me all the users, expand it out to a group because that was a query parameter on the API. Find me all the groups whose ID is equal to this. And then I need their ID, division name, and email. And I want that converted from basically JSON over to CSV. Now, again, we wanted to keep the CLI small. So we focused on what we do really, really well. But then we use JQ, and we use JQ to transform all this data. So then we get a little CSV output, and you've got the ID, the division, and their email address for those particular users that belong to this group. Now, anybody who's worked in an IT organization, you get these ad hoc requests all the time, or you need to be able to extract data out. You've got another platform coming in that needs to be pre-populated with data. So you need to build some kind of lightweight integration. This is where CLIs really, really shine. So let's go out. I'm going to go out and just do a example of how to create a user. And then we're going to walk through maybe like 2 or 3 more other things. But to do a user create, and this create could apply to anything that is a top level object that does a create. We're going to go out and we're going to create a simple user record. Our CLI provides two different mechanisms to be able to accept data for a create or an update. And a create basically maps to a post or a put underneath the covers, or a patch. We do that mapping for you. And the update does the same thing. It maps to one of those. So you can either pass that JSON record in as a file, or you can pass it in as a stream being streamed in from another command. Now, again, the JSON maps exactly to what our API would expect. So what ends up happening is if you wanted to create and provision a bunch of users, at least right now, you have to go out and create a bunch of small files with all the JSON for those users. You can use a LS and pipe it into an XArgs and then pipe it to the CLI to create in each of those individual user records. One of the items that we have on a feature roadmap long-term is to have the ability to go out and be able to basically point the CLI at a directory and say, process all the files and automatically feed it into the command. But we're not doing that right now. So let's go out and let's just look at this create user object out there. We're going to have a file called createuser.json. And in there, we're going to create a brand new user record. Let's call it that. And I am just going to cat this file. And I am going to pipe this to GC users. Or hold on, I've got a different example for piping. So I'm going to go GC users create -f create user.json. All right. And now we can see that it's created this brand new record out there, and it's got the email that I had to put in there. And I can even validate that by just doing a GC users get. All right. So we can also accept data being streamed into a CLI command for a create or an update. So sometimes you just got to be able to play around and you want to be able to create a queue real quick. Okay. And I am going to create a queue called chat9. And I am going to then want the ID. So I've got some code later on that's going to be doing that. There's my ID. All I'm doing is an echo with the JSON command, piping it into GC users create, and then piping it to JQ to pull that data out. Now, what happens if I do something like this? I want to create a queue. We got an error. So the way our CLI works for errors is we basically take out the output from the public API and stream it back out in the event that the command fails. And in this case, we always go to standard error. We don't go to standard out. So that means if you want to be able to track this, you can redirect to standard error without interrupting anything that's going to standard out. So if you're trying to take a whole slew of commands and pipe them into XArgs and then call a GC queues create or whatever you want to do, an error won't necessarily cause that whole process to fail. We spit out from our APIs, our platform API, all of the errors as JSON. So you can expect the same error messages in our platform API to be the exact same for inside of our CLI. All right. I'm going to go through two more examples, and then we're going to close this out with a little slide. One of the things that I've personally found is I work a lot with the notifications API. Our notifications API is really, really useful for being able to get messages that are coming from the cloud over a WebSocket. It's the same infrastructure we use under the covers, the exact same infrastructure our UI uses to get change announcements and data changes coming in over the cloud. So what we did is we exposed the notifications API out there in the CLI so that you can very easily from the command line set up a channel and be able to listen on it and see your messages streaming. Now, why is this important? Well, a lot of times when I'm a developer, I don't want to have to go to the web page on developer tools and watch the data streaming. I might be in Visual Studio Code. I might just have a terminal window running at the bottom. I want to be able to go to the Genesys Cloud and take various actions and see the data that's out there. For people who are particularly enterprising, you could probably feed this notification stream into a database or into a file. So if you wanted to kind of keep track of the notifications to understand kind of the flow of behavior, this would be a good tool to do this. So I'm going to go out. If you have played with our notifications API at all, the first thing you have to do is you have to create a channel. So we're going to go out, we're going to create a channel, and I'm going to go GC notifications create. And we're going to get back basically an ID for the WebSocket that was opened up on our public API. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this ID, because we're going to need this again, hold on, and I am going to create a subscription. And I've already got a file out there. So I'm going to look at create subscription. Again, our JSON maps exactly what you would expect to be released or in our API. So I am going to subscribe to this particular user's activity. And just like our API, we could have multiple subscriptions out here. We could even sit here and use a combination of piping and JQ with a environment variable placeholder to be able to pass different pieces of data in. But I am going to go out here and I'm now going to create a subscription for those topics I'm interested in on that stream. I'm going to take this streaming ID. Okay, so it's created the subscription. That would be the output of what we would get from the public API. And then all I'm going to do is now listen to any messages that are coming over the notification stream of what I've subscribed to. All right, so let's go and do this. I want to come out here. I'm actually logged into the org that I'm currently listening to. Let's go ahead and go on queue. And look at that. There is activity data out there. This would be the exact same message we'd get over our API. I don't have to write any code to do this. That's one thing I have to emphasize to developers who haven't worked very much with the CLI is CLIs are fantastic for poking at things. A lot of times you don't want to write code. You just want to understand the API. You can do a lot of this with our web tools like our API Explorer or with our notification tool that we have on our website and our developer tools. But sometimes you're just going to be working and you don't want to interrupt your flow of what you're doing. Okay, so I'm going to go off queue now. And you can see the message that was going here. And I can interrupt the queue by just doing a Control-C. So the last thing I'm going to do is go back to the example you guys saw earlier in the slide where I'm trying to get some location information and I want to transform it into JSON. I'm going to actually show this thing in action. All right. So I'm going to go out and I'm going to use our usage command, which maps to our API. So if I go out here and I go GC usage, all right, we've got GC usage, and then I can go query -- help. You can see the results out there. Okay, so with that being said, now we've got, hold on. Oh, you know what? I have a little bit of a bug here. I'm not showing the help. I'll have to go and make a note. I'm not showing the actual path. So I have to make a note of that and fix that. So, because that was an example of a custom endpoint that we wrote. So let's go out and look at our create subscription file. Nope. Let's do this. I am going to create a new file. I already have it out there. Let's look at this. Sorry about that. This is basically a command to say we want to see all of the data broken out by day for our HTTP calls to the public API, starting on February 1st and ending on February 28th. And we want to group that by the OAuth client ID and then the endpoint that was being used. So I am going to go out and I'm going to take that nasty command and we'll walk through this. And I am going to run this. And so we saw this earlier in the slides, right? We're basically just catting the data, passing it to our usage query. We just changed a little while ago from a -w to a -t to say we're going to wait 10 minutes. And if we don't finish in 10 minutes with querying this data, we're going to time out. We are going to do our transformation into JQ, putting the data in a format and a structure that we want. We didn't want all the data being turned back, and we wanted the fields because it's going to go to a CSV file to be in a specific order. And then we're going to go out and we're just going to parse it, convert it to CSV. And then from there, we can go out and we can actually put this into a pivot table. As a shameless plug too, we have an example of this using the APIs out on the blog site, where you can actually see the APIs being used to do this, but we use this also as an example of what you can do with the CLI. So I am done with my CLI commands. I'm going to go through two quick examples of where a CLI can be combined with Python. And then we're going to close out with a last few slides and do some Q&A. But one of the things, obviously at some point, you're going to start outgrowing just being able to do the CLI commands. Personally, I hate shell scripting, even though I'm a Unix admin. I do most of my work in Python. So I wanted to just share with you guys a couple of quick examples that I wrote of where I took some very simple Python code that acts as a control layer, but I'm using the CLI under the covers to do all the work. So I get auto pagination, I get automatic 429, and I basically just go out and execute these commands to do what I'm doing. This first script is basically from customers. We've heard multiple customers like, I want to move large numbers of users between different queues. I might have 3,000 users on one queue. I want to take all the people who are in a particular group. I want to move them over to another queue. Well, you can do that. It gets a little bit tricky if you're trying to do it all just via command line and shell script. So this was just an example of a script that I wrote and is out there where we just wrapper it in some Python code. As the guidance that I often give people is the CLI has a very specific time and place and niche. If you start getting over 100 lines of code for your scripts, if you're doing this type of scripting, you're probably trying to do too much, and you should be using the APIs. The CLI is really, again, hey, let's do something quick or an administrative task that I'm going to do over and over, and I really don't want to write a bunch of code for it. The other example is I gave a real simple example of being able to export from one organization into another organization some of the key objects. And this is all readily available. We have a recipe repos, which I'll point everybody to, which as we come up with examples of CLI code, or we come up with scripting code, or customers want to provide us, even our partners, we have it out basically in a GitHub repository. Okay, so on that, I'm going to flip over. I am going to get back to the slides. Let me just pop through here and just some closing thoughts. So what is the CLI good for? It's simplifying bulk administrative tasks, carrying out ad hoc operations that don't have time sensitivity, meaning let's say you want to export a bunch of data. Well, if you're going to export data, you're going to have to sit there and deal with the 429s and the backoffs and the retries. So you got a script that's running in the background that's just dumping some data. It works great for it. It's also great at poking data and prototyping. It's an administrative tool. It's not a CI/CD tool. Some people have asked, hey, can we go out and use this to do CI/CD work? The answer is you could, but I would really encourage people that you instead wait for a new tool that we've got coming out. Is our CXS code tool, which is really designed for doing more mass migration or up immutable architecture and promotion between different Genesys Cloud environments. The other thing too is be very careful about making this like a heavy duty integration tool. We've obviously done auto pagination and we've done retry logic. We've got good error handling, but in the cases that you have out there, a lot of times if you're doing a lot of business logic and business transformation, you're not going to want to use the CLI. That's something that, next slide's going to cover when to use a CLI and when to use whatever. But this is one that I often tell people is if you've got a lot of like heavy data transformation or business rules that have to be applied, the CLI is going to end up being more painful. You should probably just use the API and a programming language. So our APIs versus our SDKs versus our CLI versus CXS code. Our APIs are our lowest level programming model. There are REST APIs. You're responsible for everything. There's no contract enforcement of what's being sent to them. You have to deal with rate limiting and auto pagination. And then you also pretty much have to do everything yourself. It's a low level call. Our SDKs are a wrapper around the API in your language of choice. We do some contract enforcement. Based on the language, we offer additional capabilities like Java, for instance, we can do auto retry on connection or on a 429, but in other languages, we don't. We're working to standardize this across all of our languages. The CLI is really useful for ad hoc administrative or query needs, lightweight scripting, bulk administrative needs. But if you're looking at for a CI/CD solution, this is we're building this right now. It's not available yet. Becky can talk to this if there's questions on it, but it's more of our full-blown CI/CD tool, CXS code. And it's really about being able to promote immutably across Genesys Cloud environments. So I would really encourage people to kind of understand the differences between this. And if you're interested, talk to Becky about the CXS code. She can give you a better idea of our timeline and what capabilities it provides. Okay, so I'm going to share with you real quick. This is what we told our dev teams because a lot of them are new to CLI. I said, I challenge our dev teams, spend time using your own APIs. Little things in our public APIs make a big difference to people who consume them. I am a public API developer. I'll be the first to admit there's stuff in there that's not always good. And whenever they think there is no one who would ever do that with your API, there is, and there's usually a really, really good reason for it. And also put yourselves in the shoes of an administrator who needs to get something done. So as they're building their APIs, we actually had one of our development leads after he started playing with the CLI. He's like, I'm going to make every time we have to do a public API call or build a public API endpoint, I'm going to make them have to also write it in the CLI right away and make sure that it's consumable. So I think there is a definite focus on trying to make sure that the CLI and the public APIs become even more consumable than how they are now. My favorite line was from Andrew Johnson, who's like, just set my data free. I just want to be able to do whatever I want to do with it and don't try to do my thinking for me. Okay, so what's next? Probably our top list is we do want to be able to provide multiple files from a directory to kind of process multiple files from a directory to be able to simplify some of the bulk loading stuff that we do. We're looking at how we can improve performance through concurrency while still trying to keep us below our rate limiting pieces. And we're really going to be spending some time building out additional commands. My top three, and I'm going to add a fourth on there, even though it's not on the slide, is I want to get our analytics queries out there so that you can be able to do analytics queries from our CLI. I want to be able to expose our conversation data. Our external contacts is out there. Andrew Johnson has been a big contributor of that. And the last thing I want to do is build out further the commands we expose for administering and dealing with edges. Right now, it's pretty rudimentary. You can do some stuff like give me my edges with all my phones, reboot my edge, but we haven't exposed trunks or anything out there like that. So finally, please, if you've got commands that you want, we are always looking for PRs. Drop us a request for the CLI out in our forum or on our ideas portal. We're looking for feedback. We really, really want people to feel like this is their CLI and that they can provide direct contribution and that we are responsive. Also, please donate your recipes and hang out on the forums, answer questions. So, and look to the forums. A lot of times I'm hanging out on the forum answering CLI questions because I've been so heavily involved with the project. So I'm going to leave you with this. We have a ton of documentation and source code. These are the links. I want to show you this real quick though on the website. If you go out to our website and you go to CLI, that's our homepage. But we also have a really good blog post that we put out there that not only talks about the CLI, but some of the stuff that we're doing, some additional content. One of them is our recipes directory. This is basically where, as we're doing stuff, our solution consultants are doing stuff, professional services. And as soon as we come up with a cool recipe, we try to put it out there to just kind of keep this growing. I know as an admin, if I can beg, borrow, or steal somebody else's recipes, that can save me a couple hours. It's like pure gold. And then also we have our developer drops, which basically we have several videos out there already that are 10 to 20 minutes long, kind of going through various use cases, not only for our APIs, but our CLI. So on that, I am pretty much done. Becky, I'm ready to open the audience up to questions if anybody has any questions.
Yeah, thanks, John. And we don't have any open questions yet. Our panelists have been answering questions live, but if any of you still have questions, I know we're over time, but we can stay on and answer questions. If you do have to drop, or if you're watching this presentation asynchronously, then please visit us in the dev forum. Like John said, we're here to help and answer questions and receive your feedback. So to summarize the Q&A, John, there were several suggestions and questions about PowerShell support. And it looks like we may have some additional work that we want to do to provide better support there. So I've already captured some email addresses of some people here, some attendees that have expressed some feedback already, but if you've got additional feedback and you didn't raise your hand during the presentation, again, feel free to hit us up on the developer forum.
Absolutely. And PowerShell support is something that I would like. You'll obviously find on the website there's a Unix and OS 10 bent. Most of us are using OS 10 and Unix. We do have some Windows environments, so we do want to definitely try to do some more PowerShell stuff and get some more recipes out there. But I would also love if people come up with anything cool that they've done in PowerShell. Please do a PR on our recipes repo and please share. We are growing in that area, but it's not our strength right now. So if anybody wants to contribute, we would definitely welcome it.
And then to summarize a couple other questions that were around differences between the CLI and potential differences between the CLI and the APIs on things like rate limiting or auditability. And the summary answer there is we've tried to keep the APIs and the CLI very consistent here. So any events that are auditable and exposed in the audits API or in the audits UI, we expose those whether the events were generated by the UI, the CLI, or the public API. And the same thing goes for rate limits. Somebody asked about rate limiting for the CLI. We handle the retry logic for you in the CLI, but given that the CLI is a wrapper around the public API, it is subject to the same rate limits that public API is.
Cool. Very cool. And we're definitely looking for feedback too on what commands people want to expose. Like I said, we started small because we have a very wide and deep API. But if there's something out there that you're like, man, this would really make our life easier, please let us know.
All right. And with that, we have no more open questions and we are over time. So I think we will call this a wrap. The recording will be available on our YouTube channel, which is linked to both from the Dev Center and within the Q&A panel here. And we hope to see you again next month. Topic TBD, unless you know something I don't, Jen, but be on the lookout and we will talk to you next month.
All right. Yeah. Thanks everybody for joining and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.